Imagine one house on a quiet street in Colorado, where 12 children once filled the rooms with laughter and games. Decades later, that same house stood as a monument to tragedy, with 6 of those children lost to madness, 2 dead by their own hands, and the rest scattered across the country, carrying scars too deep to heal. This is not a story made up for a novel or a film. This is the haunting reality of Hidden Valley Road in Colorado Springs, home of the Galvin family, the most intensely studied case of inherited mental illness in America, and a place where the very limits of sanity were pushed beyond recognition. Before diving deeper into the nightmare the Galvins endured, make sure you hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what state you're watching from. Because what happened here is not confined to one family or one neighborhood. It's a story that proves how fragile the human mind can be, and how easily family bonds can be broken. The year was 1945. The war was over, the economy was booming, and young couples across the country were ready to build the families they had dreamed about during those long years of uncertainty. Among them was Donald Galvin, a striking young Air Force officer whose discipline and devotion to the American ideal matched perfectly with Mimi Blay, an intelligent, well-bred woman from Texas, determined to craft the perfect family. They settled in Colorado Springs, where the mountains and open skies promised everything was possible. Donald's career at the Air Force Academy brought prestige, while Mimi embraced her role as the model military wife with near obsession, determined to create a household that neighbors would envy. From 1945 to 1965, 12 children were born, 10 boys and 2 girls, each one expected to carry forward this vision of perfection. On the surface, their home looked like a postcard of American life. The children were athletic, gifted, and polished. Donald Sr. was celebrated publicly as a father and coach, and Mimi curated a life of ballet, opera, and cultural refinement. But behind the carefully managed image, cracks were forming. Mimi's rigid rules left no room for imperfection, and every step out of line was punished. Donald Sr., often away for work, returned more as a strict inspector than a nurturing parent. The children quickly learned to hide the tensions and fractures that grew inside their home, unaware that their lives were becoming part of a dark experiment, one written in their very DNA. At first, the spotlight fell on Donald Jr., the eldest son who seemed destined to fulfill every dream his parents had. Handsome, athletic, brilliant, adored by teachers and worshipped by siblings. But even in this golden boy, shadows soon appeared, and the Galvin legacy began its long descent into darkness. When Donald Jr. graduated from high school with a full scholarship to Colorado State University, the Galvin family celebrated as if the future had finally begun. This, they thought, was only the first of many triumphs. But college was nothing like the tightly controlled world of Hidden Valley Road. By his freshman year, the cracks were already showing. His roommates noticed he stayed awake for days, pacing the dorm halls, muttering about hidden messages in his textbooks. He told anyone who would listen that his professors were secretly testing him for a government program, and that federal agents had tapped his phone because of his exceptional abilities. The breaking point came one crisp fall night in 1963 at a campus bonfire. Without warning, Donald Jr. tore off his shirt and leapt straight into the flames. Students dragged him out with severe burns across his arms and chest. When campus authorities tried to question him, he could only stare blankly and whisper about purification rituals and messages from the fire spirits. His father quickly stepped in, using military connections to keep the incident out of the papers and off police records. Donald Jr. was quietly pulled out of school and brought back to Hidden Valley Road, where Mimi convinced herself her firstborn was simply stressed and needed home rest and family love. But Donald Jr.'s unraveling didn't stop. He disappeared for hours, only to be found standing motionless in the yard, eyes locked on the sky, as if deciphering a code only he could see. When his siblings tried to reach him, he spoke in rambling monologues about secret signals in the clouds and the voices of ancient warriors echoing from the mountains. One afternoon, young Margaret walked into the garage to find him strangling the family cat, tears streaming down his face. "It told me to," he said flatly. "It said it was the only way to stop the messages." The house descended into a state of quiet fear. Some days Donald Jr. could still be his old self, charming, articulate, the golden boy everyone adored. But more and more those moments were eclipsed by paranoia, violence, and bizarre behavior that even Mimi could no longer dismiss as stress. In 1965, Donald Jr. married a sweet, unsuspecting young woman named June, who had fallen in love during one of his brief periods of apparent normalcy. Mimi staged a lavish wedding, determined to prove the Galvins were still the shining family of Colorado Springs. But the marriage was doomed. Almost immediately, Donald Jr.'s delusions deepened. He became convinced June was part of an elaborate conspiracy to control him. He accused her of poisoning his food, tampering with his belongings, and sending secret hand signals to his enemies. When June tried to reason with Donald Jr. or reached out to his family for help, his response was terrifying. He lashed out in violent rages, leaving her shaken and bruised. Over the next 2 years, the violence escalated. He would vanish for days at a time, returning with wild stories about government agents, alien abductions, and messages from God. One of the darkest episodes came when he convinced himself that June wasn't really his wife at all, but an imposter sent to replace the real June, who he believed had been kidnapped and murdered. That night, he interrogated her for hours, demanding she prove her identity by answering bizarre and impossible questions about their past together. The breaking point came on a frigid February night in 1967. June finally told him she was leaving, that she could no longer live in constant fear. His response was chilling. He walked out silently and returned an hour later with a small bottle from a pharmacy, cyanide capsules. Calmly, almost joyfully, he told her they would die together quickly and painlessly and be free forever. June's survival instinct roared to life. She tore herself free, bolted into the night, and pounded on neighbors' doors until someone called the police. When officers arrived, they found Donald Jr. seated calmly at the kitchen table. The bottle of cyanide pills sat neatly before him, lined up like place settings for dinner. He was arrested and committed to the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo, where doctors gave him his first official diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia. They told his stunned parents there was no cure, only treatment to manage the symptoms and perhaps prevent further violence. But Donald Jr. was only the beginning. His younger brothers were approaching adulthood, each carrying the same genetic curse that had already claimed him. James, the second eldest, had always lived in Donald's shadow, desperate for the approval that came so easily to his brother. He was bright, witty, and musically gifted, capable of making even his stern father laugh. But when Donald's illness consumed him, James was thrust into the unwanted role of the new family hope, the son who must redeem the Galvin name. The pressure was unbearable. By his senior year, James began to unravel in ways frighteningly familiar. He grew convinced he was being watched, followed, and manipulated, part of a plot to drive him insane, just like his brother. Unlike Donald's dramatic collapse, James's decline was slower, but equally devastating. He withdrew from friends, spent hours locked in his room, and covered the walls with a chaotic web of clippings, photographs, and diagrams strung together with pins and thread maps of paranoia that made sense only to his fractured mind. His violence began with himself. He smashed his head against walls until his face was bruised and bloody, explaining that he was trying to silence the voices tormenting him. He carved strange symbols into his skin with kitchen knives, insisting they were protective marks to stop government agents from reading his thoughts. When Mimi tried to take the knives away, James struck her with such force that she stumbled, stunned by his sudden rage. But the darkest part of James's descent was how he turned his illness outward. His delusions and paranoia twisted into cruelty. He began preying on his youngest siblings, particularly Margaret and Mary, subjecting them to his disturbing experiments and warped sexual fantasies. For the Galvins, it became clear their nightmare was no longer confined to one son. Madness was spreading through the family like a shadow, and there was no escaping it. James's behavior turned from disturbing to predatory. He cornered his younger sisters when their parents were gone, forcing them into bizarre protective rituals he swore would shield them from evil forces. The rituals became steadily more violent and sexual. Margaret and Mary learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, to lock their doors and crawl under their beds when his voice took on that strange tone that signaled an episode. But there was nowhere in the house truly safe from James. Their parents either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge what was happening under their own roof. The chaos accelerated as James's delusions grew more dangerous. He vanished for days and returned with wild stories about secret missions and underground organizations that existed only in his mind. In one particularly grotesque episode, he became convinced the family dog was a government spy and tried to operate on it to remove hidden recording devices. By the time the 1970s began, the Galvin household bore no resemblance to the picture of perfection their neighbors once admired. Two of the eldest sons were now cycling in and out of mental institutions, their violent outbursts making it impossible to stay at home for long. Yet their absence brought no peace. Madness seemed to seep through the family like a contagion. Brian, the fourth son, began to unravel in high school. Unlike Donald Jr. and James, whose descent had been gradual, Brian's breakdown was swift and terrifying. He believed he had supernatural powers and a dark mission to change the course of history. He spent hours staring into mirrors, practicing transformation rituals, and speaking in voices that weren't his own. Where Donald Jr. and James were methodical in their madness, Brian was explosive. His rages came without warning. He attacked family members with whatever was at hand. Kitchen knives, baseball bats, his fists. In one chilling episode, he chased his younger brother Mark through the house with a hunting rifle, screaming that Mark was an imposter who had replaced the real Mark and had to be eliminated. The family finally called the police, but when officers arrived, Brian had transformed back into a polite, calm young man reading quietly in the living room as if nothing had happened. He smiled, answered their questions with apparent sincerity, and convinced them it was all a misunderstanding. Only his family knew that this mask of normalcy was temporary and that the violence would return. Then came Joseph, the seventh son. Quieter than his brothers, he had always seemed thoughtful and introspective. But as adolescence set in, his quietness took on a sinister edge. He spoke of seeing shadowy figures moving through the house at night, faces peering in through windows, and messages written in blood on walls that appeared spotless to everyone else. Even in a family hardened by years of mental illness, Joseph's visions unsettled them all. Joseph was different from his brothers. He wasn't violent, at least not outwardly, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. He would stand in the backyard for hours carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions he swore were more real than his own family. What set him apart, though, was his eerie knack for predicting events before they happened. He would announce that the phone was about to ring, and seconds later, it would. He warned family members about accidents that unfolded exactly as he described. His siblings began to avoid him, not out of fear of being attacked, but because his presence felt uncanny, almost inhuman. One night, He approached his younger sister Mary and told her flatly to stay away from the basement for 3 days because the shadow people are angry about the noise upstairs. When she pressed him for an explanation, he just stared through her with hollow eyes and repeated the warning before walking away. 3 days later, a water pipe burst in the basement, flooding it with thousands of dollars worth of damage. By 1973, the Galvin home had become a fortress of chaos. 6 of the 10 boys had been diagnosed with schizophrenia or other severe mental illnesses. The once pristine Hidden Valley Road residence was now a revolving door of police cars, hospitalizations, and desperate attempts at normalcy. Mimi, once polished and meticulous, had aged decades in just a few years. Her face was lined from stress, her posture stooped from carrying the weight of a family unraveling. She cycled through endless theories about what had cursed them. Environmental poisons, government experiments, jealous neighbors, even supernatural forces. Donald Sr. chose denial. He buried himself in military assignments, avoiding home whenever possible. Even when present, he kept a cold, commanding distance, refusing to discuss his son's conditions. To him, their breakdowns weren't illnesses, but failures, disgraces that reflected on his ability to enforce discipline. Meanwhile, the 2 youngest, Margaret and Mary, became like refugees in their own home. They learned survival tactics children should never need. They wedged chairs against their bedroom doors before bed. They kept bags packed with clothes and cash, hidden under their beds, in case they had to flee in the night. The final rupture came through Brian. Unlike Joseph's eerie detachment or James's cruelty, Brian was volatile, a storm waiting to explode. In one of his most dangerous episodes, he became convinced that his girlfriend Nancy wasn't human at all, but a demon sent to seduce and destroy him. For months, Nancy had been one of the only stable positive connections in his collapsing world. But as his paranoia deepened, even she became part of the conspiracy in his mind. On a cold November evening in 1973, Brian invited Nancy to dinner at a local restaurant near campus. She arrived expecting a normal date, maybe even hoping Brian would finally explain his strange behavior. Instead, she found herself staring at a man she no longer recognized. He spent the evening locked on her with an unsettling intensity, muttering about omens and secret signs only he could see. When she tried to break the tension with small talk, he answered in cryptic fragments about reality deception and unseen dangers. By the end of the night, Nancy wasn't just worried about Brian, she was afraid for her own safety. What happened next stunned even a family already hardened by years of violence and madness. After dinner, Brian drove Nancy to a secluded spot outside of town. There he pulled a hunting knife from his car and attacked her. The assault was sudden and merciless, fueled not by rage, but by Brian's absolute conviction that he was performing an exorcism, purging the demon he believed had taken her place. Nancy died within minutes. Moments later, Brian was calm again. He called the police himself and waited beside her body. When officers arrived, they found him covered in blood, yet speaking with the same polite, articulate tone the Galvin children had always shown in public. "I had to stop her," he explained matter-of-factly. That wasn't Nancy anymore. The thing wearing her face was going to destroy everything good in the world, starting with me and my family. Brian was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But before the case could reach trial, he was found hanging in his jail cell, dead by suicide. His note was a nearly indecipherable manifesto about secret wars between cosmic forces and his sacred duty as a chosen warrior in the battle between good and evil. The local papers wrote it off as a tragic love story gone wrong. They mentioned nothing about the Galvins' long history of schizophrenia or the growing trail of violence within the family. Inside Hidden Valley Road, though, Brian's death marked the final breaking point. any illusion of normalcy shattered. And soon, word of the Galvins' extraordinary situation reached a pioneering psychiatric researcher named Dr. Lynn DeLisi. At the time, most mental health professionals clung to the belief that schizophrenia was caused by bad parenting or trauma. The idea that it might be genetic was radical, even controversial. When DeLisi first heard of a Colorado family with 6 schizophrenic sons, she assumed it was an exaggeration. Cases like that were virtually unheard of, often dismissed as coincidence or misdiagnosis. But as she studied the medical records and consulted with doctors who had treated the boys, she realized the Galvins were not just unusual, they were unique. This family could change everything science thought it knew about mental illness. Her first meeting with them took place in a Colorado Springs hospital conference room in the spring of 1985. Mimi came alone. Donald Sr. refused to participate, viewing the whole process as an invasion of family privacy. By then, Mimi was in her 60s. The glamorous, commanding matriarch she once had been was gone. Her hair was silver, her face lined by years of grief and sleepless nights. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with brittle dignity like a survivor of a war no one else could see. When she spoke, her voice was steady and practiced, as though she had been rehearsing her words for decades. "I need to know why this happened to my family," she told DeLisi without hesitation. "I need to know if it was something we did, or something we failed to do, or if there was never anything we could have done to stop it. And I need to know if my grandchildren are going to suffer the same fate." DeLisi explained her research carefully, making no false promises. Schizophrenia was still one of the most mysterious conditions in medicine. Even with the most advanced tools of the 1980s, no one could fully explain what triggered a psychotic break. But Mimi didn't need guarantees, she needed hope. If her family's suffering could help science uncover the roots of the illness, maybe it would mean no one else would have to endure what they had. Over the following years, the entire Galvin family submitted to the study. They gave blood samples, sat through psychological evaluations, and endured interviews that unearthed the most painful details of their lives. The process was both revealing and devastating. For the Galvins, every question pulled them back into the nightmare of Hidden Valley Road. But for science, it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to glimpse the genetic blueprint of madness. For the first time, the Galvins were forced to face the full scale of what mental illness had done to them. It wasn't just the sons lost to violence and institutions, it was the scars etched into everyone else's lives. Margaret and Mary, now grown women with families of their own, had to reopen memories of childhood abuse and terror they had spent years trying to bury. The brothers who hadn't developed schizophrenia lived with constant unease, never sure if they had truly escaped or if madness still lurked in their DNA waiting to surface. Dr. Lynn DeLisi's research brought the family into the heart of a scientific breakthrough. For years, their blood samples and psychological profiles offered only fragments, raising more questions than answers. But in the early 2000s, new genetic sequencing technology finally cracked open the mystery. Scientists identified a mutation in the SHANK2 gene on chromosome 11, present in all 6 affected Galvin brothers, and their mother absent in their father and the healthy siblings. For the first time, schizophrenia could be traced to a specific genetic abnormality, rather than the old theories of bad parenting or environmental stress. For Mimi, the discovery was both relief and heartbreak. She had carried the guilt for decades, believing her controlling nature had somehow broken her sons. The research proved she hadn't caused their illnesses, but it also revealed she had unknowingly passed down the genetic curse that destroyed half her family. The findings rippled outward, influencing new studies on brain development. Dr. Robert Friedman, building on the Galvin's data, linked specific brain receptors to schizophrenia symptoms and pushed for prenatal supplements like choline to support fetal brain growth and potentially reduce risk. The science was groundbreaking, But for the Galvins, it came too late. By then, the family was scattered by tragedy. Donald Jr. spent his final years in a nursing home. His once brilliant mind eroded by decades of medication and illness, dying in 2010 as a shadow of the golden boy he had once been. James died even earlier, his body ravaged by the very antipsychotic drugs meant to stabilize him. His death certificate read natural causes, but his family knew the medications had taken him as surely as the disease itself. Of the 6 schizophrenic brothers, only Matthew and Peter lived on. Matthew's art sometimes flickered through the haze of his illness in drawings and paintings created during brief moments of clarity. Peter shuffled between diagnoses of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, cycled in and out of hospitals for most of his life. The healthy brothers, John, Michael, Richard, and Mark, managed to build families, careers, and stability. But each carried survivor's guilt and the gnawing fear that the illness could one day strike them or their children. Margaret and Mary bore the deepest scars. They became advocates for mental health awareness, determined to turn their pain into something useful. Yet they remained haunted by the impossible contradictions of their childhood brothers, who had sometimes protected them and sometimes terrorized them. And just when it seemed the family had endured every imaginable horror tragedy, struck again. In the spring of 2001, James, living in a supervised group home after years of institutionalization, was found dead in his room. The official cause, an accidental overdose of psychiatric medication. To the world, it was just another sad footnote. To the Galvins, it was one more reminder that their story was far from over. The official report ruled James's death an accident, the result of a confused dosing schedule that led him to take several days' worth of pills at once, a tragic but not uncommon fate among patients with severe mental illness. But his sister Mary was never convinced. In the weeks before his death, James had been speaking obsessively about voices that told him he was poisoning his family simply by existing, that the only way to stop the damage was to end his life. Whether it was suicide or accident, the outcome was the same one. More son lost, one more chapter of suffering written into the family's history. His funeral was quiet, attended only by immediate family. The obituary was brief, stripped of context, omitting the illness that had consumed his life. For Mimi, the loss was devastating. Despite everything, she had never stopped believing that her real son still lived somewhere inside the broken man schizophrenia had left behind. She visited him faithfully, bringing home-cooked meals, photo albums, and stories from the past, hoping to spark some flicker of recognition. After James's death, she began to retreat from the world, keeping to herself in the house on Hidden Valley Road, surrounded by ghosts. Though she continued to cooperate with Dr. DeLisi's research, her hope had faded. The breakthroughs in genetics, proof that a mutation had cursed her children, the possibility of treatments that might protect future generations felt hollow against the daily reality of loss. Donald Sr. had died years earlier from a heart attack, never acknowledging the depth of the family's suffering or his role in their unraveling. Now Mimi carried the burden alone, the last keeper of a house that had once symbolized perfection, but had become a monument to tragedy. For the next generation, the nightmare was different, but no less real. As the children of the surviving Galvins grew up, every mood swing, every rebellion, every late-night anxiety was scrutinized for signs of the family curse. Margaret's daughter Kate lived under constant watch, hyper-aware that the same genes that had claimed her uncles might surface in her. She avoided drugs and alcohol, kept strict sleep schedules, sought therapy at the first hint of stress. When she thought she heard her name called in an empty room, she reported it immediately, unwilling to dismiss anything as imagination. Her vigilance was necessary, but exhausting. Mary's children lived with the same shadow. Family gatherings became careful performances, everyone watching everyone else, silently asking who's next. While none of the third generation developed full-blown schizophrenia, several struggled with depression and anxiety conditions that in another family might have been seen as manageable, but in the Galvins carried the weight of doom. In 2017, Mimi Galvin died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93. Her death marked the end of an era. The surviving siblings returned to Hidden Valley Road to settle her affairs and decide what to do with the house. Walking through its rooms was like stepping back into the worst years of their lives. The kitchen still bore scorch marks from a fire Donald Jr. had started in a psychotic frenzy. The basement still held the restraints their father had installed a desperate measure to contain violent episodes. Every room carried echoes of laughter, screams, secrets, and suffering. Hidden Valley Road remained what it had always been, not just a house, but a witness. A silent monument to a family that wanted to be perfect, but instead became the key to unlocking the genetic mysteries of madness. The most haunting room in Hidden Valley Road was Mimi's bedroom. There she had built a shrine to the sons she lost, walls lined with childhood photographs, old report cards, and letters written from mental institutions. The room was frozen in time, a space where a mother clung to the boys she had known before mental illness stole them away. When the surviving siblings finally decided to sell the house, researchers documented everything. Every photo, every scrap of paper, every corner of the home was cataloged in the hope of extracting clues about how 12 children could grow up under one roof, with half of them consumed by madness. The house itself became an artifact, a case study in tragedy. The Galvins' participation in psychiatric research helped change science. Their DNA provided evidence that schizophrenia had genetic roots, shaping treatments and genetic counseling that continue to influence mental health care today. But for the family, those breakthroughs offered little solace. The discoveries arrived too late to save Donald Jr., James Bryan, or the others who had been claimed by the illness. The siblings endured years of invasive testing and painful interviews, driven by the fragile hope that their suffering might spare other families. Despite everything, the surviving Galvins stayed connected. They gathered for reunions that were equal parts celebration and mourning. Together they remembered Donald Jr.'s athletic glory, James's music, Brian's kindness and moments of clarity. They laughed over pranks and vacations, carefully steering around the darker memories that still had the power to wound them. Yet the shadows were always there. Empty chairs at the dinner table whispered of the brothers who should have been present. Conversations faltered when a familiar expression or phrase triggered the weight of the past. Margaret often struggled the most at these gatherings. Her love for her brothers was tangled with memories of terror, creating a psychological burden that therapy could never fully lift. Mary coped differently. She became the family historian, curating photo albums and documents to preserve not just the horrors, but also the moments of joy. Her home became an archive of rise and collapse, 12 children playing in the Colorado sun. Then the institutional mugshots of broken men they no longer recognized. The surviving brothers each carried their own scars. John, the eldest healthy son, built a business empire, channeling his need for order into work. Michael poured himself into fatherhood, determined to give his children the stability he had been denied. Richard lived under a constant cloud, haunted by his teenage brushes with mental illness and the fear that he had only narrowly escaped. Mark, one of the youngest, remembered a childhood where baseball games and family dinners coexisted with violence and psychotic breaks, teaching him that danger could lurk even in the safest spaces. The Galvin tragedy rippled outward, touching everyone who crossed their orbit: friends, neighbors' girlfriends, teachers, colleagues. Each one carried fragments of the story: the charming young men who turned violent, the respectable family unraveling behind closed doors, the perfect house hiding unthinkable secrets. Hidden Valley Road was no longer just a street address. It was a symbol of how fragile the human mind can be, and how a family's private nightmare became the key to unlocking some of science's deepest mysteries about madness. In the 1960s and 1970s, Colorado Springs was still a small community, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business. The Galvin family's troubles, no matter how carefully hidden, could never be kept entirely private. Former teachers remembered Donald Jr., James, and Brian as brilliant, promising boys whose lives veered off course in ways no one could explain. Decades later, those educators carried their own quiet guilt, wondering if they had overlooked warning signs that might have led to earlier intervention or a different outcome. The young women who had dated the Galvin brothers carried their own scars. What had once seemed like isolated incidents of jealousy, volatility, or stress were in hindsight the first eruptions of mental illness. For Nancy's family, the shock was unbearable. They had welcomed Brian into their home, never imagining that he was capable of the violence that took their daughter's life. Her parents spent years searching for red flags, questioning what they had missed, and wrestling with the fact that evil had walked into their lives disguised as a polite, promising young man. For the wider community, the Galvins' downfall was disorienting. The family had been admired as a model of success, the embodiment of post-war American ideals. Their collapse challenged assumptions not only about mental illness, but about the very idea that discipline, faith, and hard work could shield a family from chaos. Local doctors and mental health professionals were shaken, forced to confront how little they understood. Standard treatments that might stabilize a single patient collapsed under the weight of a family, where half the children descended into psychosis. Decades later, in 2020, journalist Robert Kolker published Hidden Valley Road, the first comprehensive account of the Galvin family. For the surviving siblings, cooperating with the book was both healing and traumatic. They revisited their darkest memories in exhaustive detail, but they also gained perspective through conversations with researchers, therapists, and other families on what had happened to them. For Margaret in particular, the project reshaped her understanding of her mother. For years, she had blamed Mimi for not protecting her and Mary from their brother's abuse. But as she learned more about the limited knowledge and resources available to families in the 1960s, she came to see her mother less as a negligent parent and more as a woman trapped in an impossible situation, struggling against forces she couldn't control. The book also brought the Galvins into contact with other families who had suffered through multiple cases of schizophrenia. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone. Other parents had watched helplessly as mental illness devoured their children, and other siblings had carried the same survivor's guilt and dread of inherited madness. Perhaps most importantly, Hidden Valley Road reframed their suffering. No longer just a collection of tragedies, their story became a cornerstone of scientific progress. The genetic breakthroughs made possible by their DNA were already shaping new treatments and giving other families earlier diagnoses and better tools for survival. Yet despite all the science, the most haunting truth remained. Schizophrenia was still a mystery. The Galvins had given everything time, blood, memories, lives, and still the fundamental questions about what causes the disease and how it can be stopped remained unanswered. Even after decades of research, schizophrenia remains one of psychiatry's greatest mysteries. Doctors now know that genetics play a powerful role, but why some people with the predisposition develop the illness while others do not is still unknown. Stress, trauma, and environmental triggers all appear to contribute, but the exact spark remains elusive. For the Galvins, this uncertainty is a shadow that never fully lifts. Their children and grandchildren live with the knowledge that the same mutation could one day turn their ordinary lives into another chapter of the family nightmare. Matthew and Peter, the last surviving brothers diagnosed with schizophrenia, remain in assisted care. Matthew still paints during lucid moments, his artwork hinting at the man he might have been. Peter, somewhat stabilized with age, can manage limited visits with his siblings. But the promise of who they were meant to become was long ago erased by the disease that claimed 6 of their brothers. The Galvin suffering reshaped science. Their DNA gave researchers the evidence they needed to prove schizophrenia's genetic roots, helping develop prevention strategies and treatments that are saving lives today. Yet those advances came too late for the family who sacrificed everything. 6 brilliant young men lost to madness. 2 parents watching their dream family collapse into violence and despair. 4 brothers surviving with lifelong scars. 2 sisters carrying trauma that shaped every relationship and decision in their adult lives. In many ways, the Galvin story captures both the promise and the limitation of science. Progress is measured in decades. Suffering unfolds in real time. The siblings take some comfort knowing that their brother's pain contributed to discoveries that will protect others. But they also live with the reminder that too many questions remain unanswered and too many families remain vulnerable to the same devastation. The house on Hidden Valley Road no longer belongs to the Galvins. A young family moved in, unaware of its history, drawn by the mountain views and the quiet suburban streets. They painted over the scorch marks in the kitchen, removed the restraints in the basement, and filled the rooms with new furniture and the laughter of children. But the walls remember. Subtle scratches in the plaster, dents in the concrete, faint scars left by years of violence, still linger beneath the fresh paint. Mimi's bedroom, once a shrine to the sons she refused to let go of, has been transformed into a cheerful nursery. Where photographs of 12 children once stared down from the walls, there are now colorful pictures of animals and alphabet letters. A baby sleeps soundly there, wrapped in innocence in a room that once held decades of grief. There are no ghosts on Hidden Valley Road. No supernatural explanation for what happened inside that house. The horror was entirely human, written into the cruel lottery of genetics and into a family's relentless effort to hold itself together as it unraveled from within. Even after decades of research, the Galvin family's tragedy leaves questions that science still cannot answer. Why did schizophrenia erupt so violently in this household? Why 6 brothers and not the others? Was it something in the family dynamics, the unrelenting pressure to achieve? Or the hidden fractures behind the perfect facade that triggered the genetic time bomb? Donald Jr.'s first break came just as he left home for college. James's as he struggled under the weight of his brother's collapse, and Brian's during the chaos of adolescence. The pattern suggests that stress and environment didn't just accompany the illness, they may have pulled the trigger. For the surviving family members, these questions aren't abstract, they're wounds that never close. Margaret and Mary sometimes wonder if their presence as victims added to their brother's torment. The surviving brothers wonder if they could have seen the warning signs sooner or stopped the spiral. Mimi herself, even after genetics had cleared her of blame, never stopped replaying her memories, searching for the moment where a different choice might have changed everything. Science could prove she wasn't at fault, but it could not free her from the guilt of a mother who had watched 6 children vanish into madness. Today, more than 50 years since the first signs of illness, the shadow still hangs heavy over the next generation. Every family gathering carries unspoken watchfulness. Every phone call might bring devastating news. Every milestone birthday in the late teens and early 20s feels like a countdown to disaster. The grandchildren live under constant surveillance, not malicious, but born of love mixed with fear. They track their moods, avoid substances, and undergo evaluations that most outsiders would find obsessive. The pressure is so relentless that it sometimes creates its own harm, with anxiety and depression taking root in those who haven't shown a single symptom of psychosis. Kate Galvin, Margaret's daughter, faces the burden most directly. Genetic counseling tells her the odds are significant, but not certain. Still, the decision of whether to bring children into the world feels impossibly heavy. Would she be continuing her family's story or condemning another generation to repeat its horrors? Science has given her knowledge, but not clarity. The choice is hers alone, and the weight of it is crushing. The story of Hidden Valley Road is more than a family's downfall. It is a reminder of how fragile the line is between sanity and madness. How genetics can shape destiny in ways that feel unbearably cruel. And how progress in science can come at a human cost too high to measure. What do you think? Was everything truly revealed? Or are there still secrets hiding in the shadows of this family's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this tale chilled you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Until next time, remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't fiction at all.